Hey everyone, this is part 2 of chapter 7 of Tony Cliff's The Nature of Stalinist Russia. The title of chapter 7 is titled The Russian Economy and the Law of Value. The first part was about the economic nature of the Soviet Union considered in distinction from the world economy. The second part of this chapter is about the relationship between the Stalinist economy and the world economy. So, that's where I decided to break it off, just because the video is getting too long. The remaining sections of the chapter are titled The Relations Between Russia and the World Economy and Can There Be World State Capitalism? Thank you for bearing with me with this division of the video. Just don't want to make them too long. Anyway, here we go. Let us now find out what importance the analysis of the internal relations in Russia has when abstracted from the influence of world economy. The abstraction has solved one fundamental question: that the source of the activity of the law of value is not to be found in the internal relations of the Russian economy itself. In other words, it has brought us so far nearer solving the problem of whether Russian economy is subordinated to the law of value by showing us where not to look for the law of value's source. I'm going to repeat that whole paragraph because it has a lot of italics in it. The abstraction has solved one fundamental question: that the source of the activity of the law of value is not to be found in the internal relations of the economy itself. Again, very important statement there. In other words, it has brought us so far nearer solving the problem of whether Russian economy is subordinated to the law of value by showing us where not to look for its source. The point has great importance. Nearly all those who say that Russian economy is not subordinated to the law of value, such as Hilferding, Bruno Vrizzi, and Max Shachtman, do so on the basis of the relations within the Russian economy as abstracted from world economy. Some of the few who say that Russian economy is subordinated to the law of value, quote, find its source in the internal relations. And that's, like I said in the previous video, that's a major division in theories of state capitalism in the Soviet Union. Is the Russian economy akin to one big firm, where the division of labor is determined by a central authority, or is the law of value operative? Is there competition mediated by commodity sales between the different firms, right? So Cliff is obviously of the one big factory firm, and of the one big factory position. But it should be noted that Joseph Carter, one of the initiators, I would say probably the main initiator of bureaucratic collectivist theory within the minority of the Socialist Workers' Party, he referred to the Soviet Union as one big national trust. Also, Bruno Vrizzi, he didn't call the USSR capitalist, kind of similar criteria to why Trotsky didn't, because due to nationalized property. He consistently uses the word surplus value. He uses value categories, commodity. I can't remember right now if he uses the word commodities, but he 100% uses the word surplus value. Anyway. After eliminating the internal relations in Russian economy as the source of the law of value, we must now examine the relations between the Russian and the world economy. It is here that we do find the source of the activity of the law of value to which Russian economy as a whole is subordinated, and to which therefore the internal relations of the economy are also subordinated. We have said that the relations between the Stalinist state and the total labor time of Russian society are the same as between the factory owner and the amount of labor that he acquires through buying the labor power of a certain number of workers. The division of labor is thus consciously and not anarchically realized in Russia. The division of labor is thus consciously and not anarchically realized in Russia. We have yet to set, however, why the Russian state carries out a certain division of the total labor time of Russian society, and not another sort of division. The division of labor in Russia, done independently of competition with other countries, would be absolutely arbitrary. In reality, Stalin himself, I don't know, that seems like a weird sentence to say Stalin decides, but one of the things, just sorry as a side note, one of the things that's interesting about Hilferding's critique of the state cap, the paper that he wrote is a critique of Ryan Worrall's state capitalist theory, and he was which Worrall wrote in 1939. And Worrall being an Australian Trotskyist, he was like an academic, but he's a Trotskyist. He in his critique, he basically says the bureaucracy does not rule in the Soviet Union. What rules is the heads of the party. He says that the state, like the heads of state, fundamentally rule the country, and not the bureaucracy as such. But I think it's super interesting, and can't remember, but I think he does use the fact that of the terror its effect on large segments of the state bureaucracy, not just in the party but just in general, kind of speaks to the way that economic decisions are not even dictated by the bureaucracy. Of course, you could say, well, the bureaucracy, benefits, but that's like saying. But then you could also say, in capitalism, right? Capitalists are the ruling class, but a lot of their decisions are based upon the centralizing law of value, right? So it's out of their hands or whatever. And capitalists, despite being the ruling class and being able to recover personally from it fairly well, often do or at least can lose significantly on the market. Anyway. We have yet to set, however, why the Russian state carries out a certain division of the total labor time of Russian society, and not another sort of division. The division of labor in Russia, done independently of competition with other countries, would be absolutely arbitrary. In reality, Stalin decides on the division of labor inside Russia in the same way as the individual capitalist decides on the division of labor in his factory. In reality, Stalin decides on the division of labor inside Russia in the same way as the individual capitalist decides on the division of labor in his factory. But the decision itself is derived from powers over which he has no control whatsoever. It is derived from the autonomy of world economy, from world competition. The rate of exploitation, which is the ratio between surplus labor and necessary labor. This is interesting. He says it's very. This is an interesting thing right here, and I should read the rest of the sentence. But he has here the ratio between surplus labor and necessary labor, and he has the symbol from Marx's Capital of surplus value divided by S divided by V, which is surplus value divided by variable capital, right? And while in capitalism, right, surplus value and variable capital, that's the division, right? And that's the way that surplus labor and necessary labor, in the sense of that which goes to the worker's consumption and that which is appropriated as a surplus by the capitalists, does take the form of surplus value and variable capital, but that's highly specific to capitalism, right? So this little equation here does not, it might seem like nitpicking, but this equation here does not correspond. There are two different levels of abstraction, right? Surplus labor and necessary labor might be something that's in some sense trans-historical. Maybe not in the sense of the surplus labor. I mean, obviously, in a self-managed society, the amount of surplus labor and necessary labor um, would not have their distinction because they'd be appropriated by the same group of people. But the notion of surplus is kind of like a it might be a trans-historical fact. It would be a trans-historical. It would be it's true of a communist society as well, right? The abundance over what is, there will be continue to be, in all probability, some form of growth. Obviously, that would have to be managed to meet ecological considerations. But just wanted to point out that surplus labor divided by necessary labor is not the same thing as surplus value divided by variable capital, right? One is specific to capitalism, the other is not. Anyway, just as exploitation is not specific to capitalism. The rate of exploitation, which is the ratio between surplus labor and necessary labor, S divided by V, is not dependent on the arbitrary will of the Stalinist bureaucracy, but is dictated by the pressure of world capitalism, which compels Russia to undertake a quick accumulation. The same applies to the rise in the organic composition of capital, which is constant capital to variable divided by variable capital. And again, I don't know what how this fits into Cliff's theory, but organic composition of capital, like capital itself, refers to value composition, specifically value composition of capital, right? So the constant capital divided by variable capital, they're like value magnitudes that would be necessarily represented in price, measured in money. And so organic composition of capital refers to the technical composition of the labor process. The division, the labor intensity of a labor process dictates the value composition of a particular capital, right? But that's not the only thing that dictates the value composition of a particular capital. For instance, if you can have a different value composition of a commodity with the same technical composition of the production process, if, especially in an extreme case, if say for instance the means of production are extremely cheap and wages are really high, that can be a different value composition, right? Same way around. If variable capital is really low, if the wages are super cheap and the means of consumption are really expensive, that'll change the value composition, right? So the organic composition of capital is not strictly the technical composition of a production process, but the composition of a commodity, a capital's value, the value of the commodity that a capital is producing, right? This is I don't know how Cliff's going to use this, but I'm going to suspect that he's going to kind of conflate organic composition with value composition as its influence. Like, he's going to conflate technical composition of a production process with the value composition of a commodity as dictated by the organic composition of the production process, which are two distinct things. So that's very important to consider. And that's one of the critiques that Sean Matt-Gomna, for instance, makes of Cliff's theory of capitalism in the Soviet Union, is that he uses words like accumulation, which just means growth of the means of production, as if accumulation in Marx's sense did not have a specific, did not mean something specific, specifically capital accumulation. Is that Cliff kind of collapses the use value dimensions and the value dimensions of the categories of analysis into the same thing, right? And that's an illegitimate theoretical move. if you are assuming that the USSR is a totally planned economy and that its growth is not dictated by sales of some kind. So yeah, I don't know if that's how he's going to use it. I'm just like, it just kind of jumped out to me immediately. It's very important to be specific about what the organic composition of capital, what does that concept mean? The same applies to the rise of the organic composition of capital, constant capital divided by variable capital, and therefore also to the division of the total labor time of Russian society between two departments of production, the department of means of production and the department of means of consumption. Thus now, on an international scale, the basic feature of capitalism appears, quote, anarchy in the social division of labor and despotism in the division of labor of the workshop are mutual conditions, the one of the other. I don't know, I think there's a typo in there. Basically saying anarchy in the social division of labor, despotism in the division of labor within a firm, right? So, say despotism between different units of a particular enterprise. And so in Cliff's analysis, that's how labor is divided in the Soviet Union, like it's divided in a capitalist workshop. Anyway, I'm assuming this quote is from Marx, but I think it has typos in it, which might be Cliff. I don't think it's Cliff. It's probably Marxist Internet Archive, but it's okay. It's free. Just like this is free. So if the quality sucks, then you're gonna have to fork over some cash for like a good quality of this reading, and I'm not willing to do that. Russia would achieve the same result as regards the tendencies of surplus value to variable capital, so the rate of exploitation, constant capital divided by variable capital, value composition, and the means of production department and the means of consumption department, if the pressure of international competition took the form of direct commercial competition or military pressure. If Russia made an effort to flood the world market with Russia's products, or other countries flooded the Russian market with their products, the commercial competition ensuing would drive the Russian bureaucracy to cut the cost of production by cutting wages relative to the productivity of labor, or even absolutely, increasing the rate of exploitation, again, measured in surplus value divided by variable capital, advancing the technique, increasing the ratio of constant capital to variable capital, which are, again, value magnitudes represented in money, and increasing Department 1, the means of production department, and the means of consumption department. If the international division of labor did not exist, and there were no commercial competition, but competition revealed itself purely in the field of military preparedness and war, the results would be exactly the same. If the international division of labor did not exist and there were no commercial competition, but competition revealed itself purely in the field of military preparedness and war, the results would be exactly the same. It's a wild comment. Hitherto, Russia's backwardness has ruled out any questioning of flooding foreign markets with Russian goods. On the other hand, Russian markets are kept from being flooded with foreign goods by the monopoly of foreign trade, which only military might can smash. The combination of Russia's backwardness preventing the flooding of foreign markets and the monopoly of foreign trade preventing the flooding of Russia by foreign commodities, by foreign goods, till now, relegates the commercial struggle to a place of secondary importance. So the combination of Russia's backwardness, which prevents it from flooding foreign markets, and Russia's monopoly of foreign trade, which prevents Russia from being flooded, relegates the commercial struggle to a place of secondary importance. So the competition, this is important for Cliff, the competition that Cliff is talking about is not competition mediated by commodity sales. And commodity sales is the only way that surplus value can be realized. So the surplus is not taking a value form in the Soviet Union based on Cliff's analysis. Back to the text. Where the hell am I? No, I didn't even finish that sentence, actually. The combination of these two facts, Russia's backwardness ruling out the flooding of foreign markets, and Russia's monopoly on foreign trade ruling out the flooding of its own economy, which is non-market according to Cliff, relegates the commercial struggle to a place of secondary importance and gives the military struggle pride of place. The circumstance that the internal competition takes mainly a military form brings about a very interesting result. Because of it, the law of value expresses itself in its opposite, the striving after use values. Let us elaborate on this point. I'm going to repeat that. The circumstance that the internal competition takes mainly a foreign military form brings about a very interesting result. Because of it, the law of value expresses itself in its opposite, the striving after use values. Let us elaborate on this point. As value is the only expression of the social character of labor in a society of independent producers, a capitalist tries to strengthen his competitive position by increasing the sum of values he owns. As value expresses itself in money, it makes no difference to the capitalist whether he invests his £1,000,000 in shoe production and receives £100 of profit, £100,000 of profit, or whether the capitalist invests in cannon production and receives £100,000 in profit. To get the profit, his product must be sold, like I said. Therefore, his product must have a use value, but what the use value is of no account to the capitalist. The aim is value. The means to the aim, use value. In the formula of the circulation of capital, money, commodity, money prime, or money 1, commodity, money 2, which is how it's represented here, the commodity appears only as a bridge between the first amount of money and the second amount of money. The second amount of money, if everything runs smoothly for the capitalist, being larger than the initial money. If there were extensive trade between Russia and other countries, the Stalinist bureaucracy would aim at the production of such commodities as would fetch a high price on the world market, and the purchase of the cheapest commodities possible. It would then strive, as individual capitalists do, to increase the sum of values at its disposal by producing one or another use value, indifferent to which is produced, as long as it serves its end. But if the competition with other countries is mainly military, the state as a consumer is not interested in values, or interested not in values for their own sake, but in certain definite use values such as tanks, airplanes, etc. Value expresses the existence of competitive relations between independent producers. The results of Russia's standing in competition are expressed by the elevation of use values to an end, the end being victory in this competition, use values therefore being an end still remaining a mean, while being an end still remaining a means. Right. So in socialism, right, this is me speaking, socialism use values would be an end and not a means to some other alien purpose. And what Cliff is saying is that use values are being produced as not to satisfy human needs, but to satisfy basically the purposes of the Stalinist state militarily, right? But it's important, and this is super important, is that production processes and the production of use values in an exploitative manner, and the use of those use values that are created for purposes that are hostile or neglectful of the needs of the direct producers is not enough to constitute capitalism, right? Alienation is not a capitalism does not have the monopoly on alienation, and it does not have the monopoly on exploitation. That's just my opinion. This dialectical transformation of means into end, while subordinating the means end fundamentally to the same end, takes place in the traditional capitalist countries also, although in a more veiled manner. Whereas it makes no difference to the individual Krupp whether that Krupp invests his capital in the production of guns or butter. That is, he cares not what use value the individual Krupp produces, as long as that use value brings him the maximum profit. To the state of the Krupps, the use value of the product is very important. The relations of seller and buyer are preserved between Krupp and the state. The former Krupp being only interested in value, while the state is interested only in use value. But in reality, the relations of exchange are purely formal. The state is no more than the organization of the Krupps as a collective, and the state does not give another commodity in exchange for the guns, but pays for the guns from the taxes and loans extracted from the whole German economy. This is a weird thing. It's not an in-kind trade between the state and the industry. But that's obvious. But the state is it says it's paying for them. I don't know what the fact that there's the means that they have payment that is from taxes and loans extracted from the whole German economy. I don't know what the significance of that is. Of course, the state, by its nature, isn't value producing. That's why it taxes. But that doesn't mean the state isn't a money owner or a commodity purchaser by its nature either. Anyway, the state is no more than the organization of the Krupps as a collective, and it does not give another commodity in exchange for the guns, but pays for the guns from the taxes and loans extracted from the whole German economy. Although formally the relation of exchange remains, in essence a certain technique of distributing the war effort over the whole economy is practiced. This would have been absolutely clear if the state, instead of collecting taxes and taking loans in order to buy the guns from Krupp's factory, had produced the guns itself. The slogan, quote, "guns before butter," means that the competitive relations between the capitalist powers have reached the stage where the internal division of labor is disrupted, where competition through selling and buying is replaced by direct military competition. Thus, use values have become the aim of capitalist production precisely because they are notice aim. I was very confused by that passage. What they're saying here is what's being discussed here, like the selling of arms by a private manufacturer to the state um, is fundamentally different than from the state itself producing those guns itself, as in the case of like the Soviet Union. Um, the aim still of these manufacturers, these arms manufacturers who are doing business with the state, is profit. The state might, as a purchaser, might have use values as its aim, and that's kind of what purchasing is. It's the seeking out of use values, right? Um, but that does not make it the aim of capitalist production still isn't use values. The aim of capitalist production is profit. If the state is spending a lot of money, that doesn't mean the aims of production have been changed by the private producers that it purchases goods from. I don't know. Anyway, Russia is striving for certain use values in the form of guns in order to strengthen Russia's position in internal competition, does not advance its economy nearer to a socialist economy, which is also motivated by a striving for use values, but on the contrary makes it its extreme opposite. Obviously, if an increasing rate of exploitation, an increasing subordination of the workers to the means of production, is accompanied only by greater production of guns, but not butter, the mode of production will not be less oppressive of the Russian masses, but on the contrary, much more. New section. Can there be world state capitalism? From what has been said above in this chapter, it follows that if world production were under one authority, that is, if the Stalinist bureaucracy could unite the world under the Stalinist bureaucracy's rule, and the masses suffered such a regime, we should have a system of exploitation free of the law of value and all the implications thereof. Bukharin comes to this conclusion in his book, Imperialism and World Economy. Bukharin explains that if the national state organizes the national economy, commodity production nevertheless remains, quote, in the first place in the world market, end quote. The economy is therefore state capitalist, but if, quote, the organization of all world economy is one gigantic state trust, end quote, took place, which Bukharin does not believe is possible, quote, we would have an entirely new economic form. This would be capitalism no more, for the production of commodities would have disappeared. Still less would it be socialism, as the domination of one class over the other would have remained, and even grown stronger. Such an economic structure would, most of all, resemble a slaving economy where the slave market is absent, end quote. It sounds like the bureaucratic collectivist description of the USSR. And in Rizzi's view, in a different way, Burnham's post-socialist view is going to be the nature, in different ways, I think, is going to be the nature of the future. Although they both kind of hold out hope in certain ways that this will, I don't know, never mind. Forget that whole bit. What is being described here is basically what the bureaucratic collectivists say about Russia, and in Rizzi's case, the world. There is no ground to assume that such a system could exist. If history proves us mistaken, we can only conclude that Marxism was wrong, and that the contradictions within the capitalist system do not lead to socialism, but to a new class system. See, this is like a thing that I think is the real merit of bureaucratic collectivist theory, is that it breaks from this dogma that capitalism necessarily must. The only alternative to capitalism is socialism. And that's part of the reason, I think, why Cliff insists on calling the USSR a state capitalist. I don't know if he says this explicitly, but you can just kind of get from his whole thrust that it's kind of, it's against Marxism as a body of theory to suggest that the USSR is something other than some form of capitalism, a workers' state, or socialism. Like if it's not any of those things, then Marxism fundamentally can't tell you anything about can't be a guide to uh, the revolutionary goals that Cliff himself has and other Marxists have. Right? There's this idea. I guess this idea that like what's important is saving Marxism as a body of theory as opposed to like talking about the real world, which I don't think bureaucratic collectivism or if like something happened or anything like that, if like like this doesn't really have anything like this is like the Marxism is like a teleology and like a as like a and it's kind of and the kind of view of it as like a natural like a natural science almost. Preserving it as a dogma seems like to be like the intention as opposed to using it as like a tool for understanding the modern world and what would be an emancipatory alternative to it. Instead, it must tell you directly like what system of historical steps must happen one after the other. It's interesting though that they'd be so dogmatic about like it's insisting on this, but then like not be dogmatic about about Russia being ripe for socialism or something like that. But then again, like Trotskyists get around that by saying, "Oh, so Russia's part of the world system" or something like that, which indeed it is, and I have sympathy with that position. But also, the coming to power of the Bolsheviks did not represent, like in my opinion at least, did not represent the ripeness of conditions within Russia for socialism. It just meant that a socialist party happened to was able to come to power. Within a society that I think you could very reasonably say was not capitalist yet, to the most large extent. When 1917 happened, there was 80% peasant population. I can't think. I don't believe that you can say that that's those are capitalist conditions. If 80% of the population is peasantry, 10% involved in industry of some kind, and maybe that not even including the working class. So the working class being an extreme minority in that case. It's interesting just like what they choose to be dogmatic and what not dogmatic, like what Marxists choose to be dogmatic about and what they choose not to be dogmatic about. He's clearly not dogmatic about capitalism necessarily being commercial mercantile in character or being dictated by value categories. He definitely doesn't mind turning his back on that orthodoxy. But in this very specific instance of like what comes after capitalism must be a worker state socialism or just another form of capitalism. That seems like that's a dogma that I personally don't accept, and I think it's a weakness. It's not a strength here, in my opinion. Anyway, there is no ground to assume that such a system could exist. If history proves this mistaken, we can only conclude that Marxism was wrong. Which is like, again, sorry, like, that wouldn't prove that Marxism's wrong. That wouldn't prove like anything that Marx said in like Capital, wrong, right? Except for maybe like the kind of like, the revolutionary enthusiasm that's kind of about the expropriators are expropriated, and the negation of the negation and that kind of thing, being like the necessary consequences of capitalist development. Maybe you wouldn't be able to hold on to that, and it's increasingly become less and less convincing over time. But the theory of the overall gist of the critique of political economy, which I think is Marx's main contribution to socialism, would still stand, even if a society that came after capitalism was not socialist at all. But anyway, God, I'm talking a lot. You probably want to put a bullet in my brain. Especially if you're a Cliff fan, you probably want to cut me up. There is no ground to assume that such a system could exist. If history proves us mistaken, we can only conclude that Marxism was wrong and that the contradictions within the capitalist system do not lead to socialism, but to a new class system. We should have to contradict Marx's statement that, quote, the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production, unquote. Oh no, God, we'd have to break with that. You know, that's you know, that's what a horrible thing. It's like, oh, if we don't accept that the USSR state capitalism, we're going to have to face all these horrific consequences, these horrific like theoretical consequences. There's a name for that in argument, right? You don't avoiding a conclusion because it might be because the conclusion of it is not tasteful. There's some word for that. That would if there was a production system after capitalism that was not socialism, that would not render large swaths of Marx's work bullshit. Anyway, we should have to contradict Marx's statement that, quote, the bourgeois relations of production are the last antagonistic form of the social process of production, end quote. That they are, quote, the closing chapter of the prehistoric stage of human society, end quote. Marx. To know whether out of the renewed slavery of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, a communist society will arise or not, one cannot then look to Marxian political economy, which analyzes the contradictions of capitalist society. Out of the new conditions, a new science will have to be developed, even though its roots be embedded in dialectical historical materialism. That last sentence seems pretty reasonable to me, which is not the end of the, which would not be, really the end of the world to me. If you had to, do as what people like, even though he doesn't say establish a mode of production, you'd have to do what people like Hillel Tickton tried to do, and try to establish like a new paradigm for understanding like the laws of motion of Stalinist society. Not to say that I necessarily agree with what he says, but he's like, he tried to do that without really, that's what you would have to do if the law of value is completely destroyed. Anyway, up to now, however, Marxism has not been refuted, but has affirmed itself more surely with every historical development. The revolutionary potentialities of the proletariat in the proletariat striving to be the bearer of human history are yet far from being exhausted. We are far from, quote, the organization of all world economy as one gigantic state trust, end quote. As all truth is concrete, the truth about Russia must be seen in the actual tendencies present within Russia and in Russia's relations to the world. Such an analysis has shown that even if the form of activity of the law of value in Russian economy is very complicated and full of deep internal contradictions, the law of value is nevertheless the central decisive factor in the movement of Russian economy. And again, how this is like a very weird thing to say, and this is a very unorthodox thing to say. It's just like I don't know how this unorthodoxy just smack Cliff over the face. Is that how the law of value being realized without the mediation of commodity sales is bananas. For the law of value to be externally imposed on the Soviet Union, it would have to be producing commodities and that would have to be the main thing, not a secondary consideration. The main thing that was driving the economy is producing cheap commodities for the world market, and trying to and engaging in economic competition. This notion that there's something value being fundamentally a market category, being mediated simply by the division of the world into hostile states, is not, and the and the Russian economy having to participate in that in a world of hostility is not the law of value pressing down on the Russian economy. What Cliff is saying, I think there is a lot of empirical things going for him, in the sense that Russian economy was very much dictated by the notion of competing with and outstripping the West, in terms of not in the terms of like market competition, but in the terms of just like industrial capacity and military capacity. I think he's 100% right, at least from what I understand of the Soviet history, to say that this is an important pressure on the Russian economy and decide fundamental things would happen. And I think you could say this is true of other countries as well, in different ways. But this is fundamentally in the Russian setting. If this competition is not mediated by commodity sales and not mediated by the world market, but rather military competition, this is not the law of value that's pressing down the economy. And if it's not the law of value that's pressing down on the Russian economy, and if the law of value is not operative within the Soviet Union itself, in the sense of the so-called anarchic, or not so-called, but the actual anarchic relationship between independent commodity-producing units, then there is no state capitalism in Russia. And I think when some people will say that Cliff's theory is not a theory of state capitalism, but he insists upon using that term, I think they're very much correct. Continuing on, and a lot of people would just say, "Oh, it's not state capitalism." If you take like Cliff's theory to be like the theory, and Cliff has a lot of political influence, and especially in the English-speaking world, that it's in a certain sense his view of state capitalism kind of like is the view. If you can see through the theoretical limitations of what's being said here, you would just assume that there's no way of grounding a theory of Soviet state capitalism. The USSR, I can't really give an opinion on it right here, but for the USSR to be capitalist, at the very, very least, even if you wanted to hold on to the one big firm kind of like metaphor, right? If you wanted to hold on to like the idea that the division of labor within Russia is entirely dictated by the plan, in a kind of non-mercantile, non-commercial fashion, if you want to hold on to that, you'd at very has to least to say the law that it was participating in the world economy, in the world market, not in just the arms race. That just seems goofy to me. And it's not, and again, like I said, not that it's not true what Cliff is saying about the role of the arms race on the Russian economy. You could also say like all of the the big industrialization drives, say starting with like Japan in the Meiji period, they were fundamentally responses not just to economic pressures, but also military pressures. If they wanted to remain in an autonomous country and not be subjected to imperialism and be conquered, they would have to industrialize their country, get access to weapons, and the state definitely was involved in that. Definitely assisted in those changes, and there's very much you might call like a military-industrial complex within Japan. That is true. Like this kind of like military arms race being an economic factor in the terms of like dictating state policy is absolutely true. But in the case of Russia, I just don't think you can say that the effects of that were capitalist. If what's being produced is not even commodities, just use values in the form of arms. Anyway, Engels writes in Anti-During, quote, "The value form of the commodity there is already concealed. The whole form of capitalist production, the opposition between capital and labor, the Industrial Reserve Army, the crisis, end quote. And that's from what? Oh, yeah, that's from Anti-During. Now we have dealt with the connection between the law of value and the, quote, opposition between capital and labor, end quote. But we have not yet dealt with its connection with the, quote, Industrial Reserve Army, the crisis, end quote. It's such a weird thing that he would drop that Engels quote from Anti-During. You talk about the value form of the commodity. When he said that the USSR surplus, like the surplus that the USSR is producing, is not a commodity; it's a use value. It's weird they would just say that right after saying, after going into this thing about saying the arms race basically, and the use values for the arms race is what is being built up, not commodities for sale in the world market. And then immediately talk about in the value form of the commodity, there is already concealed the whole form of capitalist production. I don't understand what the use of this quote means. Now we have dealt with the connection between the law of value and the, quote, opposition between capital and labor, end quote. But we have not yet dealt with its connection with the, quote, Industrial Reserve Army, the crisis, end quote. The complicated form which the activity of the law of value takes in Russia warns us in advance against the simplification of the analysis of the Industrial Reserve Army in the crisis, a simplification that has been the disease of the majority of those who have characterized Russia as state capitalist. Footnote. We shall deal with the concepts of those tendencies extensively in a later document in which we shall analyze in particular detail the position of R.H. Johnson and Freddie Forrest, which is, C.L.R. James and Riley Dunnievsky, the Johnson-Forrest tendency. This later that he speaks of in Birchall's biography of Cliff, Birchall says that this is not come to fruition. Anyway, end footnote. The analysis of the law of value and Russian economy dealt with this in this chapter will serve as an introduction to the analysis in the following chapter of the capitalist crisis and Russian economy. All right, so that's the end of the piece. Thanks for listening. I also want to thank you all, if anyone's listening to this. I don't know if anyone is listening to this, but I want to thank you all for listening to my little marginalia and me talking to myself. I know it's probably annoying, but I'm reading these texts with a purpose and trying to really think out try to assess them critically. So if you're a big Tony Cliff fan, I'm sorry if I was mean to your guy, but is necessary. And yeah, thanks for listening.